Next time you're ready to buy something on Amazon, use our special link by going to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. With books, movies, clothes, toys, electronics, and all of the other wonderful products that Amazon has to offer, you can make your regular purchases and help support the show. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. That's wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon to make your Amazon purchases and help support the Wake Up Call podcast at no extra cost to you. Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Richard Vedder about the higher education bubble, why college costs so much, and student loans. Dr. Vedder is Distinguished Professor of Economics Emeritus at Ohio University and Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute. He is the Director of the Center for College Affordability and Productivity and the author of Going Broke by Degree, Why College Costs Too Much. He is also a co-author of Out of Work, Unemployment and Government in 20th Century America. You can follow his work at centerforcollegeaffordability.org and on the Center's Facebook page under the Center for College Affordability and Productivity. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/college. Rich, welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you, Adam.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So I mentioned in the introduction that one of the things we'll be discussing is the higher education bubble. So let's start there with a definition. When we use the term higher education bubble, what are we referring to? What do we mean?
Well, a bubble occurs when the price of something gets out of hand with reality, where where market forces work to push the price up to a level that is not have any economic meaning in a real sense. And the feeling, the term is used with respect to colleges to mean that the price of colleges have been pushed up and up and up. And there is a feeling on many people's part, including an increasing number of potential students, that the cost is just way too high in relation to the benefits or the gains, and so that there's a problem there. Now, in the real world, which higher ed is not, say in the housing market or in the stock market or something, there will then be a collapse as people realize that the prices are out of line with reality. People will sell their shares or sell their house or whatever, and the prices will deflate. In the higher ed world, that doesn't happen because there's so much government subsidies and third-party payments, mostly government subsidies, that sort of keep the thing afloat and do not allow the collapse. Simply doesn't occur. Market forces are not operating in the way they do in most of the economy, and so the term bubble has to be used somewhat advisably for that reason. We're not going to see a collapse in tuition fees, for example. Although even there, I'll have to say, in the last few years, colleges have had enrollment declines for 5 years in a row, and 2016 was the fifth consecutive year of enrollment declines. And even with all the government subsidies in the world, students are starting to wake up and say, is it really worth the cost of going to college? And for many it is still, but for some it is not. And so increasing numbers are just saying no to college.
Yeah, and before we look at why college costs so much, I want to ask some fundamental questions about college. So why do we even have universities, and why would someone partake in the higher education process? Why would someone even go through all of this when it costs so much?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and there's actually two parts. The first part is, why do we have universities at all? And the second part is, why do we subsidize them? Why do we have government support of them? The first question is that people, of course, in some cases, go to college to obtain skills which are useful in the workplace. Civil engineers and mechanical engineers and accountants are people that actually learn to do their skill while in college. Other people go to college for consumption purposes. They go to have fun, to have a good time. Some people go to college allegedly to gain virtue and become better citizens and learn the difference between right and wrong. At least this is theoretically what is stated. I frankly don't know that it works that way. But the related question is, why should governments spend a lot of taxpayer money to subsidize colleges? And the argument always has been is that, well, colleges have spillover effects. It's not just the student who benefits from college, it's all of society. And I don't think that that's true. I just don't think that's true. I think that there's, that's the argument. What are the benefits to society as a whole? If you go to college and get a degree, which you could, do I benefit from that? Someone else, third party? The argument is they do, that college graduates encourage non-college graduates to perform better, to behave better, to be better persons. College graduates don't smoke, for example, as much. So maybe if you have a lot of college graduates, that'll encourage other people not to smoke, etc. And so there's been an argument, another argument for college is that it helps bring about greater equality of condition among the people, that colleges are a great equalizer, that somehow we bring people all together on a college campus and we take poor people and give them the education and a ticket to the middle class, and they become better off, and it equalizes income. Well, the evidence doesn't really support that. If anything, income has become more unequal in the last several decades of high college participation than earlier. And by the way, don't even accept the premise that income equality is necessarily a good goal. But even if you were to accept that premise of sort of the mantra of progressives in the United States, I don't think college has done a thing to improve equality of opportunity in this country.
Sure.
I think college is kind of questionable, the government support. On AGRA. Milton Friedman, by the way, wrote me right before he died. Milton Friedman, who's a great libertarian, had said, in his book Capitalism and Freedom, a half century ago, said, one thing government ought to support our colleges because they have all these positive spillover effects. Well, I asked him shortly before he died, I said, do you really still believe that? And he wrote me back and said, no, I don't really anymore. He says it's an interesting question whether we ought to tax universities or subsidize them. Maybe we ought to tax universities. Maybe they're a nuisance to society. Maybe they have negative spillover effects. So anyway, I think the whole basic premise on which public education exists, at the higher education level at least, is somewhat suspect.
Sure. And of course, we're also seeing a bit of a decline in what's provided on many college campuses. And I want to get to that subject in a moment. But let's return to the subject of college, of why college costs so much. Let's look at that. Now, you've been suggesting that subsidies have something to do with that, and that sort of makes sense. So how much of it is subsidies, and what are some of the other factors that go into this explosion in college costs that we're seeing now and have been seeing for quite a while?
Okay. First of all, there is a small amount of the increase in college costs that I think has absolutely nothing to do with government. And indeed, it existed even before government got involved in higher ed. For example, you can argue that higher ed is really teaching students, and that it's a bit like acting, like putting on King Lear. A professor, when he gets in front of a group of students, is like an actor. And the ability to mechanize that process or turn it over to a machine is far less than it is in manufacturing or in some other sectors of the economy. I teach about as effectively, maybe if I'm lucky, as Socrates did 2,400 years ago, and I teach the same number of students as Socrates did. There's been no technological improvements in teaching. So that is argument is because of that, and because over time wages go up with economic growth, we have to pay professors more and more and more, even though they're not teaching any more students than they used to, and so that college is inherently becoming more expensive. This is an argument that's been argued for decades. There is a smidgen of truth to it, but only a smidgen of truth, because most universities spend most of their monies on things other than college professors. Only about a quarter or a third of the budget at a typical university goes for college professors, and we got swarms of administrators, and we spend a lot of money on intercollegiate athletics at some schools. We student affairs, fancy buildings for rock climbing and so forth, and rec centers and so on. So between 1840, and that's going back a ways, in 1978, mostly an era when government's role in higher ed was pretty minimal, prices of college went up about 1% a year, more than the overall inflation rate, about 1% a year. But since 1978, they've gone up 3% a year. And that acceleration, I think, reflects the fact that the government has gotten mixed up in the higher ed business, particularly through student financial aid programs of the federal government.
All right. So then, when did this start? What you mentioned 1978, and there was a bit of a turning point, but this goes back to the Great Society and maybe even before then, correct?
Yeah. We did have one very popular and program that went back earlier with a GI Bill, which was actually enacted in 1944, which could be viewed as sort of a deferred compensation for soldiers who had participated in World War II and later wars as well. And it's sort of a fringe benefit that if you go in the Army and you serve, you're going to be able to get a cheap education, subsidized education afterwards. We had that, and then, but the Higher Education Act, and there's some other minor legislation in the late 50s, but the Higher Education Act of 1965, the Great Society era, as you mentioned, is the period where this really starts to get started on a larger scale, and mostly it's modest size until the mid-70s, and then in 78 there was a big expansion of Pell Grants and what we now call Pell Grants and student loans. We made them available not just for very, very low-income students, but to a wide range of middle-income students as well. And so the programs really start exploding in the late 70s, and they get really big in the 90s and the 2000s. And just have taken off. I think in 1970 we were spending about $1 billion in 1970 dollars on various federal programs to help college students. Put it in today's dollars, that may be $8 billion, and we're now actually spending about 20 times that. So the programs have expanded 10 or 20-fold in that period. And the gainers haven't been the students. The gainers have been the colleges, because when the federal government offers loan money, say, to a student to go to college, what do the colleges do? They see that and they say, we can raise our fees more aggressively than before because the kids can find the money, by borrowing to pay for it. So so that's happened, and there's a good bit of, incidentally, empirical evidence that supports this. And what that means is the colleges take in more tuition money than they otherwise would. And where does that money go? Well, some of it goes to people like me, college professors, who get lower teaching loads, higher salaries. A lot go to administrators. Colleges have hired armies of bureaucrats and to work for them in recent decades, and some of it, ends up in scholarship aid for students and so on. But the students aren't the main beneficiaries. It is the community. It's the academic community on college campuses that are benefiting from an academic arms race that the federal government's financing through its various student financial aid programs.
Yeah, and I want to flesh that point out a little bit more because it makes sense at a very basic level that if you have an academic arms race and you have more money spent on higher education, then you're going to see the students really benefiting. But it doesn't work out that way. Instead, we see student debt getting racked up to incredible levels. We see declines in the quality of education in many campuses. It doesn't really help the students, as you just mentioned. But can you flesh out a little more why that isn't the case?
Well, you're exactly right. And by the way, the byproducts of all this are you made a very good point that there's a quality decline that comes with this. First of all, the student financial aid, unlike private scholarship aid, there's no tie to academic performance whatsoever. In fact, a student who does poorly in college gets more aid than a student who does well. A student who does poorly in college usually takes 5 or 6 years to graduate, and so they get 6 years of financial aid instead of 4. And if they get a barely 2-point average on a 4-point scale or even less, they're barely hanging on in school. They get the same aid as the good student. And as I say, really, they get more because they get it for a longer period of time. So all the incentives in the system are promote mediocrity. They also lead kids to go to college who really, if I may be blunt, don't belong. They don't have the intellectual skills. They don't have the discipline. They don't do well in college. They end up not graduating from college, and they become part of an army of underemployed college students who become baristas, who go to work on construction and drive taxis and so on. But honorable enough occupations, I have nothing against those occupations, but you don't need a college degree for it.
Yeah,
I didn't answer your question really, but I think I am fleshing out the argument a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're also seeing at colleges themselves that while the hard sciences and literature and philosophy and some of these subjects are offered, we're also seeing classes in all sorts of other subjects that sort of go against the tradition that we've seen in higher education up to recent years.
Yes, the core academic disciplines are still being taught. There's no doubt about that. And there are students who are getting degrees in engineering and in philosophy and history and in sort of traditional majors. But there are an awful lot of people who are taking courses, some of which have sort of an ideological orientation in various and sundry fields, gender studies. We didn't have a gender studies 50 years ago, for good reason. So there's a lot of frills going on in higher education, a lot of decline in the quality. There's a lot of political indoctrination going on that, as opposed to teaching truth and beauty and knowledge and facts and the meaning of life. There's a lot of political orientation to some of the new curricular additions, and I think that is regrettable.
Absolutely. So let's turn our attention now in this conversation to student loans. And let's start off just by looking at how student loans work, which you've explained some already, but just to make this a little clearer to those who are listening, how do student loans work, and why do student loans factor so prominently into these ridiculous costs that we're seeing today?
Well, first of all, they're large in magnitude. In a typical year, there's way over $100 billion of federal money being lent to students. Closer, if you count grants as well as loans, it goes past $150 billion. And so that's a lot of money. There's only 20 million kids, and they're not all kids, some of them are adults, going to college in any given year. In fact, now they're less than 20. They're about 19 million. So you do the math, 150 billion divided by 20 million is about $8,000 a student. So there's a lot of money being pushed out by the federal government into student hands to supposedly cover college costs. Now, the programs are Byzantine in their complexity. There isn't one loan program or two loan programs or financial aid programs in general. We have a whole variety of loan programs, Perkins loans, we have subsidized loans, we have unsubsidized loans. We have something called PLUS loans, which are actually made in many cases to parents of students, believe it or not. We have, in addition, we have the long-time work-study program. We have tuition tax credits. We have Pell Grants. So instead of having just one or two programs, the government has more than a dozen, in fact, more than 15 programs of one sort or other. So it is a very complex system. And I think almost everyone who has done any work on this subject, even people on the left politically as well as on the right politically, agree that it is much, much too complicated. And one of the byproducts of this is that in order to get any of this money, you have to fill out a form showing your financial background and so forth. It's called the FAFSA form, a free application for student financial aid, FAFSA, and that form has generally, in most years, been over 100 questions long. You almost need a college degree to fill out the form. And one of the byproducts of that is low-income people who come from families where the parents perhaps only have a 10th grade education or a high school education, they have trouble understanding the form, and a lot of low-income kids don't even fill it out because it's too complex. So one of the goals of all of this student aid, these programs when they started, was to help lower-income people graduate from college, go to college. We actually have a smaller percentage of kids from the bottom 25% of the income distribution graduating from college today than we did in 1970. So that sort of fundamental basic goal is we're going to help poor kids go to college isn't being realized because poor kids, first they have this incredibly complex form, and now they're facing, even at a state school, tuition fees of $10,000, $12,000. Some state schools even more. If you go out of state, it's $25,000 at some of these schools. And so they see these monstrously large numbers, and they say, there's no way I can afford this. In some cases, they really could afford it because of scholarships and so on. But they tune themselves out of the college, out of looking at colleges. So one of the biggest failures of this program is it's not even serving particularly well the students that it was first designed to serve, the lower income members of society.
Next time you're ready to buy something through Amazon, go to our special link at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Whether you're buying clothes, toys, electronics, sports equipment, books, movies, or any number of other products, our special Amazon link at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon is the place to go to make your Amazon purchases. And particularly relevant for today's episode, You can purchase Going Broke by Degree, Why College Costs Too Much by Richard Vedder when you go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Make your shopping experience easier and faster and help support the Wake Up Call podcast by buying the stuff you're going to buy anyways through our link via wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon. Again, that's wakeupcallpodcast.com/Amazon to make your regular purchases and at no extra cost to you, help support the show and keep the Wake Up Call podcast going. Well, that's a very interesting point that you raised there. Now, you listed off several programs that are in existence in your answer there, and I don't want to go through all of them. We just don't have time for it, but I do want to pick out one in particular that seems to get a fair amount of discussion, and that is Pell Grants. So
Sure.
What are Pell Grants and what purpose are they supposed to serve?
Well, Pell Grants were designed to serve lower income students, and they were just an out-and-out grant of funds with a maximum amount now in the between 5,000 and 6,000, a little closer to 6,000 than 5,000. So you can get a grant if you're a low-income person of, say, $5,000 towards paying the tuition at the school you go. The grant, by the way, doesn't come to the individual like a voucher that they can then just take and use at any school they want. The money usually goes to the school, and when the kid applies or the student applies to a particular college, the financial aid office says, we have some Pell Grant money, you're eligible for that money. So the Pell Grant is designed to lower the cost of college for lower income students. Well, over the years, the definition of the eligibility requirements have greatly expanded, and there are now people from families with, say, $50,000, $60,000 annual incomes at least at the middle of the American population as a whole. There are some of these people are getting these Pell Grants. So these grants can be renewed for many, many years. There are students around who've had them for 6 years, for example. They have no educational requirements associated with them other than attending as a full-time student an accredited university, but you don't have to meet a certain grade point minimum or anything like that. So they are, of course, very popular. They're just 8 or 9 million Americans now get them, which is getting on towards half of the total student population. So it's obvious they're obviously going to some middle-class kids who are not poor by most people's definition of that word. So obviously they're a big part of the picture.
Sure, and let's look at the entire picture, at least as far as student loan debt is concerned. So how much student loan debt is there right now in the United States, and why is this such a big crisis for so many people?
Well, the number that's most often used these days is $1.3 trillion. Now, that's more than the amount of money outstanding in loan debt on credit cards. It's more than the amount outstanding on car loans. So it's a pretty big category of money. And there are about 40 million or a little over 40 million Americans who have this debt. And these aren't all just young kids who are, say, 24, 25, a year or two out of college. In fact, the last I looked, the median age of borrowers of those with debt is in the 30s, mid-30s. And there's an increasing number who are even 60 or over who have borrowed this money. Some of them were adults when they borrowed the money, and they borrowed it 25 years ago, and they're still paying it off, or they're not paying it off. And so there is $1.3 trillion. Now, if you do the math, that works out an average debt per borrower of around $30,000. And for some people, $30,000 is a lot money, particularly after college you find you can't get a very good job and you end up working at as a barista or in a big box retail store or something like that. Maybe you're making $30,000 a year, $25,000 a year. Your debt is even greater than what you're making in a year's income. For people like that, the debt is a pretty burdensome thing. Actually, a lot of the debt is held by graduate students, students who've gone to graduate school or professional school, doctors, lawyers, people getting their PhD in French or whatever. A person who gets his or her PhD in French, and I'm not picking on France, by the way. I love French, actually. We could conduct this interview in French if you want. A lot of those people go out and eventually get a job, maybe as a high school French teacher, making $32,000 a year to start, and they have $80,000 or $100,000 in debt. And so for those people, it's a very burdensome thing. And so one of the big problems is that a lot of people are just not paying back their debt. And there's a huge problem that way, and it was just revealed in the last week that the education department has just out and out understated that debt problem, that repayment problem, and they claim there was a programming error. A lot of people are dubious of that claim, and that there are over 1,000 schools in the United States where half or more of the people who have borrowed money to go to college, who have student loans, over half of them have not paid $1 back on those loans over the last 7 years. So there's just a huge a problem of non-repayment because and the government has aggravated this by politicians saying, "Oh, we'll forgive your loans," they're too burdensome. We'll propose to forgive them. And so people are saying, why should we pay back our loans? Maybe the politicians are going to just let us out of this obligation. So it's a huge problem.
Sure. And someone with student loan debt can't even bankrupt themselves out of it, right? It's an issue that's pretty much with them forever until they pay it off.
That's right. It's one of the few forms of debt obligations that is not, as the lawyers say, dischargeable in bankruptcy. So if you go into debt, you've got that debt until it's paid off for the rest of your life.
All right. Now, you mentioned moments ago some solutions that have been proposed by politicians. So what are some of the solutions that we hear? Bernie Sanders, of course, talked about student loans and college costs a lot, and we've heard Barack Obama discuss this some. Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee, has discussed this at some degree. So what are some of these solutions that we hear from politicians, and what are some of the problems with these solutions?
Okay. Well, the politicians who I will roughly say are on the left, meaning they're relatively so-called progressive politicians, or liberal in the U.S. sense of that word, have favored either of two approaches. One is to simply abolish tuition, to largely eliminate the problem. We'll just make tuition go away. We'll have free college. Bernie Sanders pushed that hard, and Hillary, who was a little more reluctant on that, came along and pretty much went along with the same idea. Now, Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York State, for example, has pushed a free tuition idea for New York residents, and some other governors as well. So that's one approach. Another approach that people have used is, we'll make it easier for you to repay the loans. And one way to do that is we'll put a maximum percentage of your income that you'll have to repay. Say it won't be more than 10% of your what they call discretionary income, which is income after paying for basic items like food and housing. So that's one approach. And at some point, we'll forgive your loans if you've just gone on and on and on forever, 15 or 20 years, and you haven't been able to repay them. We'll just say enough's enough. you're forgiven. Or if you decide to take a job which is judged to be a good job, namely working for the nonprofit sector, we'll forgive your loans then. So if you decide to take a job working for the government, you won't have to repay the loans. But if you decide to go to work for General Motors or for Microsoft, you will have to pay your loan, which, by the way, implicitly assumes there's some kinds of jobs which are sort of good jobs and other kinds of jobs which are bad jobs. And the bad jobs are the one in the for-profit sector, which I personally find quite objectionable, speaking subjectively myself. So these are people on the left have proposed. There are huge problems with this. First of all, it's very, very costly to do this. It requires a lot of money. We're a nation that's running up a $500 billion or so of additional debt every year, which we're borrowing. In many cases, we're borrowing from people overseas, from Chinese and Arab investors, for example. And we're just adding to that debt, which ultimately has to be repaid in some fashion. There is a cost to it, and we are putting that cost on future generations, which you could argue is immoral. So that's one problem. It's costly. Another problem is that there's what economists call a moral hazard problem here. When you start to say to people, well, we'll forgive your debt if you take a certain type of job, or after 20 years, if you haven't paid it off, forget about it. People are going to see that, and they're going to say, gee, they're not really serious about collecting on these debts, so I'll just go and borrow more and more and more. It encourages more irresponsible behavior, and it adds to the problem. So, but the worst thing is the inequity to the good guy or the good gal who goes and pays off their loan, who works hard, religiously sends in whatever the amount of money needed to make loan payments and pay the loan off in a timely fashion, say 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And there are a lot of people who do that, and those people are being treated very unfairly. They paid their loans back. We're letting some other people who have not paid their loans back, in some cases they could have, but they chose not to, we're letting those people off scot-free. So that's terribly unfair. So there's a lot of objections to these Sanders proposal from people like Sanders or Hillary Clinton or Senator Warren. Senator Warren adds a new wrinkle is she said, well, we'll just lower the interest rates on these down to 1% or 2% or some very, very low interest rate, and which is another form of subsidy. So those are some of the ideas that those on the left have.
So what ideas do you have then? What solutions do you think would be best for solving this current mess with the college cost explosion and the massive student loan debt?
Well, I think any solution is going to involve some adjustments by people, some pain. And if I were the czar of the country, I probably would end these programs within 2 or 3 years very quickly, let those who are currently borrowing money to finish out borrowing for a couple more years and then end them. There are some ideas out there that are sort of private sector solutions that I think are intriguing, that are not in common because of some minor, I think relatively minor legal issues. The most prominent of these is something that's called an income share agreement, ISA. It used to be called human capital contract. And under this, a prospective student goes to a private investor, financial service company, and says, I want to go to college and I'm going to need, say, $40,000 over the next 4 years to do it. In addition to the resources I already have, I need another $40,000. What kind of deal will you make me? In other words, if you give me the $40,000, what do I have to give you back? And the answer might be, we will give you the $40,000 if you agree in writing that at the end of your college career, for the first 10 years out of college, you will give us 8% of your income, or maybe it'll be 12% of your income, and the terms will vary with the risk associated with with providing the student the money. The risk shifts from the student, who's usually at 18, 19 years old, is not very knowledgeable about finances anyway. The risk of borrowing, which now exists, would be shifted, in this case, to the investor, the private investor. The investor would take the risk. If the student does extremely well out of college, that 8 or 10% or whatever the proportion might be of income for whatever number of years it is, might turn out to be a spectacularly large number. The student gets $40,000 in aid from the investor, but ends up paying $150,000, $200,000 back. The investor hits a home run. There will be another student who will graduate from college who will not do so well, and that the investor will only get $20,000 of the $40,000 back. So, over the whole sample of investors, of students, it's possible that the investor can make a reasonable rate of return. This is an idea which completely gets the government out of the business. It still provides aid to students, and it does it in a way that the only reason why we don't have it today is, first of all, we have the federal student loan program. People don't need this alternative, and there are some legal problems with the law right now that it's not clear that the investor can collect on this debt. In other words, it's not clear that these contracts are enforceable. There probably needs to be some clarification of that legally. Really a relatively minor thing to do, non-costly thing to do, and it has these contracts have all sorts of interesting features. A person who goes to a low quality school and majors in gender studies and takes 6 years takes forever to graduate, and was a poor student in high school, the investor would probably say to that person, we're not going to lend you. We're not going to give you the money. Or we might say, we'll give it to you, but you got to give us 20% of your income for 20 years after graduation. Pretty onerous terms. The MIT student who's going to MIT in electrical engineering, who's for sure going to make $65,000, $70,000 a year minimum right out of college, maybe more. The investor would lend them the money maybe for only ask for 6 or 7 or 8% of the money of their income for maybe only 6 or 7 years. So the terms on these loans would provide great information how the real world values a college education and how they value the qualifications of various students, how they value different colleges, how they value different majors. So it would provide rich information which would be useful in the future for future students. But it would also get the government out of the business, and it would relieve the students of the anxiety of having to worry about paying back these loans.
Well, and one other potential solution, this is where I want to conclude our conversation, and this very much flies in the face of what we hear from politicians whenever we hear politicians proposing free community college or tuition-free college. They're very much promoting the traditional higher education path. But one potential solution, and we've hinted at this already, is for the marketplace to come up with alternatives to traditional higher education for those individuals where traditional higher education maybe doesn't make the most sense for them, and maybe some sort of alternative would make more sense and would be a better option.
Absolutely, Adam. First of all, more kids should be not getting four-year degrees. Some of them maybe should go for a year to truck driving school to learn how to drive an 18-wheel truck. Maybe some of them should be learning to cut hair. There are a lot of things people can do that become a welder. Welders make good money, and it doesn't take 4 years and a degree to do it. There's no reason why that piece of paper that we call a college degree should be the main way of certifying whether a person is competent in life. There are alternative ways we can do it. There's examination approaches like the equivalent to the GED at the high school level that bright kids should be able to take, and even if they haven't gone to college, to show, hey, I'm not dumb. I know something about life. There are all sorts of alternatives to the traditional college, including vocational ed, and we should be looking at them all.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. If someone wants to learn more about the subjects we've been discussing, and if someone wants to follow your work, what readings and resources and websites would you direct them to?
Well, I have a study that maybe would be kind of interesting on my Center for College Affordability.org. You can pick this up. I did a study called 36 Steps to Higher Education Reform in America. That is a pretty comprehensive, about a 50, 60-page document that lists all the various problems we're having in higher ed. Some of them are non-economic problems relating to freedom of people to speak on campus and things like that we haven't even talked about today. And it goes through all of these, and it's not a bad little study for people who are interested in seeing higher education changed in the United States.
Sure, and of course there are all sorts of free speech issues on college campuses, and you're right, we didn't get to those. But I do want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/college, and there will be links there, of course, to all the resources that we've discussed over the course of this interview, including the book Going Broke by Degree, Why College Costs Too Much, as well as that study you just mentioned and some related episodes of this show. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/college is the place to go for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher. That helps us out and that helps you out, because then you can get all the episodes and make sure to not miss any. And Rich, thank you so much for your time today and for joining me and for helping me take a look at the higher education bubble and why college costs so much and just exactly what's going on with student loans and why there is such a big crisis there. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we can speak again sometime soon.
I enjoyed it immensely. Thanks, Adam.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.